Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Just start off, I think, by emphasising that Bureau Happold isn't really a technology company. We're engineers. We tend to work on master plans for major cities, so I think I come at this from a slightly different perspective. It's a big subject as well, and my brief was talk for about 20 minutes and try and make it interesting. I hope I've done that. Clearly, there's a lot of things I can't cover. Humour me as best you can. What I was going to talk about really was the role of autonomous systems in transport, and particularly driverless systems. And originally the thought was to talk about driverless vehicles, driverless cars, but we have a gentleman who's going to talk about that. And also, the more I thought about it, the more I thought that actually there's a lot of issues around track-based systems that we still haven't got to grips with anyway. So what I'm going to talk about today really is looking at track-based autonomous transport systems and then seeing what sort of that guides us to in terms of open road systems. So let's start by looking at track systems first. So what do I mean by a track-based system? Well, I mean bespoke vehicles, segregated route, controlled environment, and a point-to-point journey. Simple as that. Now, setting aside the irony that I'm going to describe an imaginary journey on the tube, given what's happening today, I think it's useful just to think through how much autonomy there currently is in systems anyway. So let's think about it. We're going to take a trip on the Victoria line. Your Oyster card's running low, so the first thing you do is you top it up at the machine. Oyster cards have now been in place just over 10 years. Hard almost to imagine a world without Oyster cards, but that's the situation. You travel down to the platform on an escalator. Is an escalator an autonomous system? It sort of is. They were introduced in 1911. If you read about it, it's quite interesting, because originally everybody was horrified at the thought, and they actually had people to show you how to use an escalator, which again seems quite amusing. But very quickly they became immensely popular and were introduced across the whole system. The train pulls in. Now, there's a man in the cab on the Victoria line, but you know what? He's not actually driving the train. What he does is he opens the doors, checks it's okay, and then he closes the doors again. The driving of the vehicle is done from a central system. It's what we call ATO. That was introduced in 1968. So we have had, strictly speaking, driverless tubes since 1968. Obviously then, you travel through, you go back up the escalator, you go back through the ticket gates, all lots of automated systems. But I think what's interesting, and I guess the point I wanted to make was that when you travel around on the London Underground, although there is a lot of automation, there is a lot of people as well. And I think it's important, particularly in transport, as we'll talk about later, that while there will be growing automation, I think there's always going to be an important human role there. I don't know how many people know this, but the most reliable system in London is the Docklands Light Railway. It opened in 1987. Just check, get it right. 11 trains and 15 stations when it first opened. For those of you who remember it, it used to have those sort of coach-type doors, so if you stood in the wrong place, you used to get squished as the door opened. Now has sliding doors, obviously. It's now got 40 stations, over 100 trains, played a really big part in access to the Olympics for those who went. I think the most important thing is, I checked the statistics for February. In February, 99.35% of the DLR trains ran on time. This is a driverless system. Of course, interestingly, it does have a man on the train. He's called the train captain, but he doesn't drive it. Okay, so you'd think with that actually we'd have lots of driverless systems because, I mean, we're talking about things that were introduced in 1968. We're talking about the DLR. The DLR's been around a long time. Actually, they're the exception, not the rule. Interesting. And again, you only have to think about, now I should stress that I did write this about 6 weeks ago. It is genuinely purely coincidence. But why is that? Well, one only has to look at the plans for the new Piccadilly line trains to see the sort of problems that occur when people try to introduce things like driverless systems. You may or may not be aware, but Transport for London has launched the procurement of 100 new trains for the Piccadilly line. They will be the first trains on the London Underground without a driver's cab, assuming they ever actually get introduced, of course. Now, there are systems like that in Paris, but in London, that will be the first one, because even the DLR, interestingly, does have a facility for it to be driven by the train captain. The train captain never actually drives it, but there is a facility there for the train captain to drive it. So this will be the first systems without a cab. The unions are not happy. They point out issues around safety. I have to confess, taking a straw poll, I think a lot of people have concerns around safety. It's not just the unions. This is an important issue. So if we're struggling to get autonomous systems, driverless systems in particular, into a highly controlled environment like the London Underground, what's really the chance for the open road? I mean, there's a lot of news around driverless vehicles. This was from December. Apparently, we're going to be a world centre for the development of driverless cars. That's great. But I think we need to look behind that rhetoric, because I think maybe what we think of as driverless cars and maybe what's happening is slightly different. I was pleased that the pod came up as a successful scheme, because I thought I'd mention it. I actually park in this car park when I go to Heathrow just so I can go on the pod. It's great fun if you haven't been on it. Trust me, it really is fun. It's like being in a 1970s sci-fi movie. For those who don't know it, if you park at the remote business car park at Terminal 5, there are these pods. It's about a 5-minute journey. It says you can fit 4 people in it, but I think you'd have to be 4 quite small people. Certainly it's quite comfortable for 2. As you can see, it's driverless. I understand it's guided by laser. It has a segregated track. They say that 80% of passengers don't have to wait, and no one has to wait more than about 10 or 15 seconds. I don't know, certainly my experience is they're always there, they're always immediate, you always get on, you go. Heathrow is saying they're now going to expand it to Terminals 2 and 3, the same idea. And I think these systems, which we in the trade would call the sort of first last mile systems, are actually very interesting. Very popular in any kind of campus location. If you think about it, this sort of situation, very popular. Also, potentially links between, say, railway stations and again, airports, or maybe between railway stations which are next door to each other, but the high-speed train doesn't run through. So I think these are very important. It's a major step forward. It's very impressive. I think we all think it's a good thing, but it's still a track-based system in my view. So I thought we'd look at Milton Keynes. Milton Keynes was what generated all the excitement in December. I particularly like this picture because I don't know if you can see, although it's an artist's impression, the little man has his hand up to show he's not driving, which I think is kind of fun. So this is part of what's called the Low Carbon Urban Transport Zone programme. It's being developed by the great and the good, and it's being located in Milton Keynes. And part of it is this driverless car component. And I think the picture sort of explains it, but what you need to understand is what it's actually looking at is a route between the railway station and the city centre. The pod apparently won't go more than 12 miles an hour. And of course, Milton Keynes is famous for its very wide footpaths. As I understand it at the moment, what they're doing is they're painting lines, installing barriers, doing other things to create a segregated path. And then what's going to happen is it's going to be a 3-stage process. They're going to start operating pods on a totally segregated route and with 100% driver control. Assuming that all goes fine, they will move to a situation where the pods continue to operate on a segregated route, but will go over to autonomous control, so they'll become driverless. And then, if that goes fine, they will apparently remove the segregation, the physical segregation. Of course, interestingly, given these will have been operating for over 3 years, one suspects that there'll be a mental map in people's mind as to where the segregation is anyway. But of course, that's the plan. And as I said, as I understand it, there is no guarantee they will get to stage 3. I think they're doing it quite rightly on a stage-by-stage basis. I think the issue actually for me is speed. This is analysis of pedestrian accidents. There's a whole series of different data sets looking at pedestrian accidents. This and other ones show that effectively, if you're hit by a car going at 40 miles an hour, you've got a 50% chance you'll be killed. If you're hit by a car going at 30 miles an hour, you've got a 9% chance of being killed. And if you're hit by a car going at 20 miles an hour, then it's close to 0. You'll be quite unlucky if you die. Now you all know why those 20 mile an hour speed limits are up, and hopefully that's why you'll all follow them from now on. Very important. So, I mean, is Milton Keynes getting us off the track? I'm not convinced. It seems to me that what Milton Keynes is trying to do is just define the track a little bit more informally. It seems to me fundamentally at the end of the day, it's a first mile, last mile system that's still running effectively on a track. And I wonder, dare I say it, rather than driverless car, maybe we should call it a motorized pedestrian. Okay. I think what we need to keep in mind, and some people have touched on it, is what's motivating the various parties. Clearly industry is being motivated by sales. I think the man on the street is being motivated by the thought that maybe his life will be a bit easier. But I would hope government is thinking about some of the wider issues. There's clearly safety, there's emissions, there's efficiencies. And I think there are also civil liberty issues that we need to be aware of. So where do we stand today? Well, we do have sections of road that are segregated for specific vehicles. This is the Beltway in Washington, D.C. Now, the bit, depending on which way you look at it, the bit at the top is segregated. It's actually segregated for people who want to pay to avoid any congestion on the route. So you pay for the privilege of using a section there that's not congested. But in principle, it will be quite easy for us to segregate sections of motorway, particularly, and other major roads for specific vehicle types. Why not driverless cars? And of course, there is an ever-growing body of devices at the side of the road that are installed by the network operator of roads, which can communicate potentially with vehicles as well to give them lots of information. So, in theory, the infrastructure could be there for driverless vehicles on the road. Obviously, we're going to hear more, I think, next, but manufacturers are promising us the technology to achieve it. And as I understand it, a lot of the technology, at least in terms of onboard radar, 3D stereoscopic cameras and things, are already installed in a lot of vehicles. It is also true that legislators are starting to grapple with the issue about driverless vehicles. Yeah. But I would say that I think it's one thing to introduce a law to let Google run some test vehicles around some highways in Los Angeles, and another altogether to let everybody out there get out and start running around in driverless cars. We've already touched on it. The whole issue of testing and approval of vehicles is going to be a big issue. I mean, think what's going to happen to the MOT process to classify vehicles as safe to operate under this situation. And then, of course, as we discussed, liability is a major issue. I have an American friend who said Americans are so litigious that America will never be the first place to introduce driverless cars because they won't be able to get to grips with the liability issue. Interesting. Actually, though, I think the biggest challenge is, do people actually want this? Okay. Now, I confess. The headline's a bit melodramatic, and I deliberately picked the most melodramatic of the headlines. But this is a headline from a respectable publication, and it was actually referring to a survey done by the Institute of Mechanical Engineers. And what it showed was that only 1 in 5 people would welcome this sort of technology in the UK. 56% said under no way would they ever allow control of their car across to these sorts of systems. The really dry quote, which I will give you, which came with the survey was, These findings suggest that people in Britain are not convinced of the benefits of driverless technology. Yeah. Now this is from the Reason Foundation. Reason Foundation's in America. For those who don't know, the Reason Foundation has a very strong political agenda. Should we simply say they're not very keen on President Obama? Leave it at that. But I think they sort of touch on where I suspect we are going, which is we're going to a world of assisted driving. I don't think we're going to a system of driverless vehicles. And as the Reason Foundation imply, I suspect it is probably whether we like it or not. So, I was told to finish with something controversial. So, where should we be in 10 years' time? I think there will be more automated transport. I think despite the problems at the moment, the strikes and other things, we are going to see more driverless trains on the underground and indeed elsewhere. But I don't think people should be worried that that means less people. I think smart businesses realise that as you put more technology in, actually your differentiator is probably your human face. So I think businesses in transport will continue to push that side. I think there's going to be more first last mile systems, as we saw. I think that the Heathrow Pod one is very good. We're going to see more of those. And in principle, I think we'll see more of the Milton Keynes type systems as well. I think what is interesting and what a lot of people are grappling with is whether things like the technology we see in the pod and in Milton Keynes will actually also start to change the way particularly city dwellers view car ownership. There has been a big growth in car clubs that you're probably aware of. And one of the debates is whether if really all you want from your car is to go a mile or 2 miles to, say, the supermarket or whatever from your local place, will car clubs increasingly do that? And if you're going to go to car clubs with controlled vehicles, maybe point-to-point movements, maybe these first last mile systems will become more common. So I think there could be a change there. And I think those sorts of things can be introduced without the issue that we discussed earlier about everybody having to have it before we do it. So I think we could get that. As I said, I think there will be more technology to assist drivers, but I think at the end of the day, you're still going to be sitting there waiting to take control. I know we've got to talk later about aviation, and I'm interested to hear what's going to be said about pilotless planes. But I think it is a bit like a plane at the moment. I think at the end of the day, we're not going to break out of that situation. I don't think we're going to go driverless in the fast lane. I'm not sure we'll ever go driverless in the fast lane. I think most people actually quite like driving and probably quite like driving fast. But I think in environments where vehicles travel very slowly, I think we could. I think car parks is an obvious one. I mean, you can increase the efficiencies of car parking. Why not the electric valet? Why not drop your car off at the end, go and do whatever you want to do, it parks and comes back for you later. I think that sort of whole concept. I think campus environments as well, we've talked about it before, where there's very controlled environments, very slow speeds, I think we could well start to see more and more of those sorts of things. Clearly, it's going to need to be in the car, but I think that'll happen. And I think last, and this probably reflects my naturally anarchic personality, for better or worse, I do see a growing temptation for policymakers to influence driver behaviour. There is a lot of talk, for example, about rather than having 20-mile-an-hour signs, speed limits and signs and things, in principle, there's no reason why you couldn't introduce technology where every vehicle was fitted with a speed limiter, and as you entered a certain zone, your vehicle was automatically reduced down to 20 miles an hour. I think those sorts of things are very good. I can see all the benefits. I guess, like the Reason Foundation, what always concerns me slightly is what's the stage that follows on from that. But I think those sorts of things could well start to happen, and I think that in principle that's what we will see. Maybe not 10 years, but maybe 20 years. Okay, and with that I'll hand over to the next speaker.